about ready. Look, a few more people coming. It's good to see so many people here tonight. But maybe it's not surprising. Welcome to a night at the John Oxley Library. As you know, we're talking about the Johnstone Gallery and Brian and Marjorie Johnstone, who ran it. They've been left out of the history books a bit, I think, when it comes to art in Australia. If you're here tonight, you probably have an interest in them to start with, and they're both fascinating people who did a lot for art in Australia, as you know. We'll talk a bit more about them shortly. Hopefully they won't mind. There's a lot of their correspondence and scrapbooks over there, which suggests to me that they might have had an inkling that people would be interested in their lives. And there's some really interesting things over there too. Helen Cole, the senior librarian here who's organised this, was showing me the scrapbooks, and I was a little shaken to see an original Russell Drysdale sketch. I know he did a lot, but of the Queen, a portrait of the Queen from the rear, naked, quoting Menzies, "I did but see her passing by," which is worth a look. It's in 1971, the scrapbook. And there's some a little bit risque letters. The letters reveal, I suppose, that casual, friendly relationship between the Johnstones and the artists, which is fascinating. Now, the Johnstone Gallery was one of Australia's most important private galleries during the 50s and 60s, and it closed in 1972, discovering and promoting artists, as you know, such as Charles Blackman and Margaret Olley, Ray Crook, Lawrence Dawes, and others were exhibited there. Margaret Olley described it as the best gallery ever, I think I saw recently. And I think she must have enjoyed the relationship with the Johnstones, as all the artists seem to have done, if you look at their letters. It was a very special era in Australian history, in art history, and there's a lot of nostalgia growing for that period, isn't there, at the time? We've got Hot Modernism on the exhibition downstairs too. The Johnstones were in many ways remarkable. Brian was Indian-born, Duntroon-trained soldier, aide-de-camp to the Governor, Laverack, I believe. Marge was a talented actress, and she worked on ABC dramas. And together they were quite a team. I'll leave the proper descriptions to the people who knew them. Simon Elliott is the Assistant Director, Curatorial and Educational Services of the National Gallery of Australia. Simon's parents, Murray and Jill Elliott, were great friends of the Johnstones. So he grew up with them. Victor Mace was the Assistant Director of the Johnstone Gallery from 69 to 72, and he's kept up the lineage all of these years. He runs his own fine art and decorative arts gallery, Victor Mace Fine Art in Milton. Victor, you lived with the Johnstones?
No, I didn't.
But you worked there for those years, so you were, very closely
Quite close.
associated.
Oh, I knew Brian long before I worked for him, because I used to buy paintings from him.
Yes. How well
I was
did...
well trained.
He was well trained by you.
No, he trained me.
How well did the team of Brian the soldier and Marjorie the actress work together?
Oh, very solidly. I mean, Marge was the backup and always was there supporting Brian.
What were the qualities that they had, though, each of them, that contributed, I guess, to the success of the gallery? What was, Brian was a soldier. That military experience helped?
Yes, he wasn't, like a lot of military people, he wasn't well organised.
He wasn't well organised.
He could put things off to be done at a later date.
So it was Marjorie.
No, Marge was a very spontaneous person. I mean, there could be a half a dozen extra people roll up and she'd somehow manage lunch out of the kitchen, so it was all spur of the moment sort of thing.
So how much time did you spend in the house during those years?
Oh, don't know.
Did you
8 to 10 hours a day?
Yeah, well, you virtually lived with them there, didn't you?
I didn't sleep there.
No. Do you remember Simon coming over?
Oh, yes.
Yes, when he was a boy? What do you remember?
He was coming home from school.
Yeah, and he'd pop in.
His father would bring him in with them as they were coming home from school.
Because
You're still in short pants then.
Still in short pants. So Simon, your father was friends with the Johnston, but you were a boy, really, when the gallery itself was operating. What do you remember about that?
It's true, and welcome everyone. I was a boy, and my memory of the gallery when it was operational was only very hazy. I remember big paintings and looking up at them and thinking they were crazy. But the couple of things and so my friendship with the Johnstons came after they closed, and I think they had no children, and I think they were looking around for someone who might be someone who could wax furniture or move a painting, and so that became, I was very lucky. That became me. And I think Brian enjoyed the fact that he used to smoke, and he wasn't allowed to smoke inside the house because it upset Marjorie. So he and I would share a cigarette. My parents in the audience, they don't know this, I don't think, would share a cigarette out the back. And that, I think Brian just had me around to have someone to talk to be honest. But I certainly remember you went through a very heavy set of wooden gates that faced onto the road, and you literally were transformed in that you stepped across into the garden. For any of you, I'm sure there's many, remember there's a very special garden. It's very hard to, you'll see some pictures, I'm sure. It's this semi-modernist meets tropical Queensland. It's quite unusual garden. And it was so different, and you felt that you were somewhere special. And as a kid, they never chased you around saying, don't touch and don't do this. You always felt like you were welcome. And at that stage, of course, I wasn't looking so much at the art, but there was lots of Shillham stone sculptures, including one that Victor would remember was one that was a nude that Brian referred to as the woman with the cross-eyed tits. And you'll see that in the photographs now that I've mentioned to you. So I have lots of warm memories.
And that must have rubbed off. Surely.
Potentially, yes.
How much do you credit your career now with your experiences then?
It's a funny thing. I did art at school, and when I went to university, I actually thought filmmaking was much more important. And Brian had a lovely. He'd seen a lot of the world, and he saw me as someone who was rather idealistic, and I was at university. And he would be very quick to make sure I knew that all these aspirational things could be brought down to, the reality of the situation. So he was always quick to set up contemporary art and say, what's the difference between good art and something that was clever art. And he would talk a bit about that. And I'm sure he talked to you, Victor, about how you define clever art from real art. And of course
I never had that one.
And of course he made his living by selling what he thought was great art. And I think, do you ever think he sold a painting that he didn't think was good, Victor?
No, or he thought the artist was good.
Yeah.
I mean, you always get the odd painting that's not as great as another one. I mean, that's part of the business.
So where did he get his eye from, Brian, of being a soldier?
Look, it's a really good question. I think Brian liked the person as the artist, and I think that once he liked you as a person, he liked the art. And I think he was lucky in that he used other artists to give him introduction to other artists, and I think he also had a soft spot, Victor, if you think so. Because it was the end of the war, there were people who had gone through military service, I think, and who were artists. I think he had a soft spot for them.
That was a prime factor of the gallery.
Yeah.
He always looked at those people.
So you can see the relationships in the correspondence. But he, I mean, what was the relationship between Brian and the artists? I mean, they appeared to be great friends.
Oh, on the whole, yes.
Well, who were his favourites? Drysdale's over there, and there's a lot of very familiar
Drysdale
letters.
used to turn up at 7 o'clock in the morning before anybody was out of bed for breakfast.
Where did he come from to tea?
He was probably
based in
going
London,
to Mackay for a meeting.
Oh.
And had to stop off in Brisbane in those days. It went direct flight. So he'd stop off in Brisbane and come and have breakfast and then go on.
What about the others? I mean, did the artists pop in like that? Was that the
no, because a great many of them lived overseas. I mean, Donald Friend lived away, and Arthur Boyd and David Boyd. They didn't live in Australia as such at that time.
So how did that relationship develop? Was it? I mean, there was. It seems to be a quite personal friendship that he's developed.
Well, it
Was
was established much more when they were young, when the artists were younger.
right.
That built a solid base, and it just continued.
Over the years, because they were in business for, was it
22 years.
22 years, yeah.
Which was a long record in those days. It's not now.
No. Why do you think this, career, done true military man, born in India, even thought of opening an art gallery? How did that all start?
That I can't answer.
He must have mentioned it at some stage. He
No,
must
he
have
never
dropped the
did.
hints. No,
He never did. In fact, it's not a question I ever asked either.
Was he a man?
He
who
just
talk-
accepted it.
Did he talk about himself much?
Not really.
Not a great
no.
deal. But he was very good with people, though. He was
Oh,
a very
yes.
personable person.
Yes. Hmm.
He must have been a pretty good salesman, do you think, then? To sell himself as well as the art in that sort of way.
He was a very honest person. I think that's what got across to people, that he really wasn't trying to just sell them a painting. They were very welcome to come and see all the paintings and his own collection. And we'd all spend hours talking about giving guided tours, So, and in that way, because people got to know more about the artist and that, they got more involved.
Right. So he developed a personal relationship through which he managed to have this enormous clientele.
Yes.
Yeah, and that was
And
the
also
important-
to those artists that he was showing
Yes.
became recognised.
Yes.
And people accepted that what he was saying was gospel then.
Well, that sounds like he was a very, very good salesman. Then. There are all the tricks.
Look, I think he was, but his galleries were set in a house. So if those people that remember, originally he was in the back of Upper Edward Street with Hugh Hale, and then he moved into what was an old bomb shelter in the Brisbane Arcade, got tuberculosis, closed, and then opened in Cintra Road. Cintra Road?
Cintra.
And so he opened in a house, which meant I think people could actually see what a painting would look like in their house, because he had all these galleries, and at one stage he in square feet alone, square feet of the time, his was the biggest gallery in Australia in terms of its sheer size, operating 6 galleries across that building, and Victor was responsible for those galleries. But I think people could actually see them in their own home, and Margie's talent for dressing them up and putting them together and putting little objects together just made it, look very special. And I think people just saw it and went, the IKEA of the 60s, really.
He had a philosophy, didn't he? And I think you mentioned that in an article I've got here. But he actually, did he printed it?
He did, yes. He published it in his. I'm not quite sure. Certainly in the early days, and he said that to put an original picture in every home in Queensland, we intend to secure as many fine pictures as possible and sell them within a range of the moderate wage earner. Art should be part of everybody's daily life and not treated as some highbrow hobby. That is classic, Brian, don't you think?
Did he sell many paintings that way? Obviously,
Well,
he did.
he had record show after selling in Brisbane, which Robert Hughes just said something along the lines of it was he had again some great turn of phrase.
I think it's there actually. I saw the Robert Hughes quote.
A more remote from contemporary currents of Australia, let alone overseas art, than any other city except presumably Darwin. The hot tropical town on stilts beside a tepid river is cut off by distance, lack of incentive, and a slow fading public philistinism.
So
Classic Hugh.
was he responsible then for this narrative that Brisbane's the back blocks
Robert
culturally?
Hughes?
Yes. Can we blame him?
No, I don't think you can blame him. I think if you look at the narrative around the Queensland Art Gallery, and I worked at the Queensland Art Gallery happily for many, many years, after Robert Haynes and the directorship that was Winnicky and then Raoul Mellish, who employed me, there was a lack of incentive. There was a lack of art education. There was a lack of art recognition in Brisbane, and that was easily transported to Sydney and Melbourne as a Philistine, far north, border, stop at the tick gates. Culture stops here. So that was. And I think what the Johnstones did was one, build an oasis around that culture, and so many people their lives were changed by that. And Nancy Underhill, who's done the exhibition out at the University of Queensland, coming from America, was saying this really, the Johnstones household and going to their openings and going and being with Brian and Marjorie was a touchstone for her, culturally and artistically. And they sold huge amounts of art to Sydney and Melbourne from Brisbane.
How did they manage to do that? Because the artists and the clients weren't here. How did they actually do that from Brisbane then?
Victor, do you want to have a go at that?
Brian used to go regularly to Sydney, but don't forget that the show exhibition here was always a big attraction for a great many people. And every year you'd see the big country people all come to Brisbane for the show because they were exhibiting cattle or doing something or judging. And they always made a point of calling into the gallery. And so Brian made a lot of connections through those people and then kept that up during the year by, as you can see, there's a letter there of saying I'll be in Sydney, for clients and all the rest of it. And so he did call and see them personally. And hence that, plus his slide box and the slides of the current show. And
Did a lot of, and his philosophy was to put a painting in the home of everybody in Brisbane. Are there many Drysdales and Boyds around Brisbane as a result of that?
Look, I think there are. I don't think he lived to that philosophy of getting a painting in everyone's home. But he because I think he was, he could have easily been a very conservative dealer. I mean, even if you wanted to start out with kind of brash young things, you could just rest on your laurels and keep the Drysdales and let them run their course. But Brian was often taking on new people, and he changed media. So he would do Sepik Island material, or he would do Persian rugs, or he would do Russian icons, or he would do jewellery and photography. And even quite late in the period, he put on, he'd take on someone like Peter Kennedy, who was a Brisbane-born artist. First show by Peter Kennedy, first one-person show by John Mulvig. These guys are not, at the time, they were not close to the avant-garde.
They were unknown.
They were unknown, untested. And Brian wanted to keep pressing he wanted to keep it interesting for himself.
And was art, by comparison with the prices we pay now, was art more affordable then? Could you pop along? Who would be able to buy it? No.
I think it's fair to say art is always expensive.
In the 60s was 350 guineas.
Right.
And in 72, an Arthur Boyd was $5,000. My wages were about $80 a week.
Yes.
You could afford an Arthur Boyd.
Still would have been a good buy.
Oh, don't say it wouldn't have been.
I think I was reading this morning that the last show he had of Nolan, he had $500,000 worth of art on for sale, and that was a record for anybody to have that much money sitting in a commercial gallery ready for sale. I think that's what I read. So $500,000 in 1971 would be a substantial sum of money.
My word. So, but then he was selling to clients in Sydney and Melbourne, and he'd pop down there, and you just brought along a suitcase that Brian used.
Helen, can I touch it?
It's too late. You handed it over. You have to use white gloves now. This is the suitcase that Brian used to take to Sydney and Melbourne, from which he'd produce his slides of the artwork he wanted to sell and show them to his clients. But
I hope it was, Victor.
Is it?
Does that ring a bell?
It looks awfully.
It looks
like
very
it to
similar.
Me.
So he would, as Victor said, he would write to his main people, and he would say, I'll be in the Wentworth Hotel or whatever it is from Thursday at 2:00 till, Saturday at 1:00, and please come and I'll have my usual things. And so Arthur Davenport, whose slides document much of everything that Brian had, he would put into this little humble bag, into this port. In fact, you put some in here. That's a surprise. And he would take that down, and he would have a light box, and he would show people what they could buy.
The light box was actually made to fit
that's
in,
right, you're right.
in the case.
Mm.
And it worked. So people would see the slides, and how would he hand over the artwork?
I would pack it and send it.
You'd pack it, so they based on the slides, and they'd buy it.
Well, they always had the option of returning it.
Yes.
We never did have returns, but they did have that option.
We mentioned the price of art back then and now, but Brian really was a bit he didn't particularly like. He wanted to sell to people that he wanted to sell to. It wasn't really wasn't always about the money. He just sort of despised people, I think, who wanted to invest in art. He wanted people who actually genuinely wanted to buy it.
I had to lay by my Drysdale drawing when I bought it in '68.
Oh, really?
It was $175.
Oh, do you still have it?
Yes.
Oh, what is it? Can you describe it?
A drawing of Maudie.
Okay.
Pen drawing of Maudie.
So Brian was obviously happy to sell to you. Were there people he wasn't happy to sell to?
I think he'd had such a rush on the Drysdale, he didn't have options.
Right. No.
I think his term he used the term swine a fair amount, and I think this was a bit of grandstanding, I think, by Brian, and that's fair enough. I won't sell to that swine because he's just buying it for the investment. But I think the truth is that they were trying to run a business, and they'd sell to practically anybody. But when there was a lot of attention on certain objects, I'm quite sure he preferenced certain buyers and certain collectors over
did
others.
Discriminate.
Yeah.
So did he consider himself an art dealer or an agent?
No, he was never an art dealer.
He was never an art dealer.
No.
Always an agent. And an agent, I suppose, implies a personal relationship, doesn't it, more than a dealer? Do you think?
Yes, you're representing that artist and looking out for his interests of trying to get him into public collections and all those sort of areas.
And the State Library of Queensland has the letters from the artist to him, and you can see that. You can see the over the years too, can't you? Those relationships build, and also the artists become more confident or change.
Yeah, I think so. I think, picking up the point that you made earlier, and I think that military background of Brian was he kept all his correspondence. So he kept a carbon copy because Mrs. Mackenzie used to type them in triplicate, maybe, or double.
That was a normal way of running an office.
Yeah. But, he kept them, and so he had both his outgoing correspondence and he kept the incoming correspondence. So, and because many of his artists were overseas or not in Brisbane, he has this incredible documentation of that period of time in those artists' lives, which were, the time that they were forming up their own practice and their own career. So it really is, what the library's got is just wonderful. It's just
I don't
endlessly
know.
wonderful.
Is there a copy of the cable that Brian sent to Nolan in the correspondence?
Which one? There's a lot of.
No, there's only one.
Oh, can you describe it, Victor?
Yes, he wrote to Nolan, and you mentioned the show. That's what prompted me. In 71, I think
Yes.
it was. Yeah. And he wrote to Nolan and said, "This is the only time I've ever arranged a show on one cable."
Right.
Very huffily.
Well, let's talk about Marge a bit, because she was older than him, and you kept in contact with Marge after she died, didn't you, Simon?
Sure.
After Brian died, yes. Sales.
The Ouija board.
The Ouija board. I can feel the presence here already. And it was through that connection that the scrapbooks came to the library.
Yes, but even when Brian was alive, Marge built the scrapbooks, so she documented and lovingly built those scrapbooks, and they kept them in a certain office that Victor would know well, and it was quite clear by the time I came along that this was a resource. And the only problem was I knew it wasn't going to go to the Queensland Art Gallery because Brian had famously considered them to be full of swine, and I knew that they weren't going there. And so it was a question about where does this invaluable piece of Brisbane history go? And at that time, the library was being set up, and so. You know, it was made to happen, but that was even in Brian's time. That was preset. My job was simply to carry it out at some future date.
But Marge was such a strong personality herself, wasn't she? And she was an actress, and she was friends with Vivien Leigh.
Yeah. Well, her career, I mean, you don't get much because people associate Marge and Brian so closely, but before they even met, Marge had been working in London as an actress. And really was cutting well above her weight, and knew people in that scene, and Vivien Leigh was one of them. And when Vivien Leigh would come out, they would come over. I don't know whether you were around, Victor.
No, not when Vivien was here.
And of course, it's because of their love of the theatre that they gifted the land that the 12th Night Theatre sits on is actually Marge's parents' land originally. That was her land, and they gave that to 12th Night and raised money over years and years for 12th Night to be built, and because that was their love of theatre.
Marge also inveigled Hamilton Slee, who owned the Golden Fleece service station on the corner, to donate part of that.
Is that right? There you
Yes.
go.
Right.
So she got a much bigger parcel of land that way.
Because they were expanding constantly, it seemed. Wasn't
Brian
it?
had a building every 12 months.
Right.
I mean,
He had to have a new project. Is that
Yes.
the case? So what was that like? Because he bought the house next door and then he extended.
Well, that's the annex, yes,
Yes.
where it has the big courtyard, the slate courtyard, and the big glass showcase, which you'll possibly see photographs of. And that was initially 4 large paintings. I mean, he virtually commissioned artists to create large paintings, and that was really the first time we'd seen them in Australia.
So he needed the space.
Well, he built it as
built
a
it
space
especially, yep.
specifically to house large works, and so that followed through.
So after all this building in 1972, they decided to get out of the business. After all of that.
Oh, well,
How big a shock was that? You were there.
quite a shock.
It was a surprise to you?
Yes, total.
Was it a... I suppose, do you know why?
No.
No.
No, there were many reasons why Brian made that decision, and Simon might know better than I do, but I don't think Brian ever explained it in, very definite ways.
But Brian was a man who made decisions, didn't he? He was...
Oh, no, Marge would have been agreeing with him, but the other factor is, of course, the state of Marge's health. I mean, that also came into it very highly.
Right. And the dog, Lindy, too, I think.
Had died, yes.
Died. So that was a big effect. And you can imagine a big part of their lives. It's not a trivial thing, is it?
No.
A
But
grief
also
over-
another big factor was that Brian was finding it harder to get the shows that he wanted.
Right.
The likes of Arthur Boyd and Nolan living in London, he couldn't get a show when he wanted it from them, or Drysdale for that matter. He did the one Nolan show, which was only works on paper, and one of Drysdale. I mean, that's covering about 12 or 15 years.
Yes. So
So
the
you-
reasons were complicated. But
Yes.
it was 1972 was a fairly significant year in Australian cultural... It's almost like the start of a cultural
Yeah,
revolution.
it was the
we
year
had.
before the recession.
But but after that, there was a lot of art. There was a lot of films being produced. All of a sudden, now we sort of almost found our culture. It seems
But the people that Brian had been showing over those years were the centre point of all
right.
of that.
Yes.
And we now look at the 60s artist, as they're called, as being the pivotal of heritage.
Yes.
You're no longer looking at the Heidelberg School, you're really looking at those 60s painters.
So there was a base there for the 70s to take off. Simon?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think he gave up. I think he closed the doors because he was exhausted. I mean, why wouldn't you be? After 21 years of every 3 weeks having to put in a show, I mean, having your workplace in your house, I mean, let's face it.
He wasn't doing one show. I mean, there was quite
right.
often 3 shows on at the same time.
Yeah. So I think, just sheer exhaustion plays a part. I do think, I think there was an angle where he thought he had enough clientele, excuse me, I'm going to cough, excuse me, that would keep coming back to him to buy art. Sorry. I'm going to stand up and really cough.
That's right, it's that time of year, isn't it? Well, 1970,
I think
yes.
what Simon was saying was that this is borne out by the video at the University of Queensland exhibition that Margaret Olley did. And Brian had approached her about getting major works on that after he'd closed the gallery. And because she then tied herself to other galleries, she wasn't willing to help him. And so that factor followed through with the various artists. They weren't particularly keen on giving you major works. They wanted, just a general representation.
Yes.
Yeah. Is that, and that was was that a significant change, I guess, in the art market that happened then, do you think?
I think a number of changes were happening. There were more. If you look at all the household name galleries that are commercial galleries now, they came, sometime after Brian had opened. So as Victor says, it was simply getting harder to entice those artists to show with him major works in Brisbane, and sometimes he was lucky and he made that happen. I think also a number of galleries were operating a particular system with their artists that Brian told me that he didn't like at all. So it was a sort of a contract arrangement. So you would sign for an artist for 3 years and you would get an advance, and then you would sell everything through that dealer. And he thought that was the wrong thing to do, and he never did that with his own artists. But it basically tied up some of the great artists. And again, I think combined with the fact that you've been running a business for 21 years, and they had done well, let's face it. I think they wanted to retire, and I think Brian thought he would keep his hand in by special collections and by commissions and things that never really came about.
Was it a business model that would work today if the Johnstones were about today? That type of agents, clients, artists, personal relationship?
I might have to ask Victor.
Victor?
What do you
Simple
reckon?
word, no.
No? No? We were talking earlier, you quoted an article, Ray Hughes mentioned, we used to be a society, but now we're an economy.
Yeah.
That's true in a lot of aspects, isn't it?
Well, it is. And the artists are primary in that. And that's the problem. I mean, the artists aren't willing to starve in the attic any longer. They want to make a living out of what they do.
Victor, you have an art business still. Do you consider yourself an agent? Or
Oh yes, no,
you do.
I
Yeah?
still follow that path. Yes.
And is it something that you hark back to? Do you when you think of representing artists? Do you often think of the way Brian did it? Is it something that you've taken on?
It takes a certain mentality to be a dealer or a dealer art gallery. And if you don't have that to start with, then you've got problems. You'd fail as a dealer, whereas you can be quite successful as an agent gallery.
I see, yes. But it must be is it a cutthroat business today?
It is nowadays.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Very much so.
Back then, the Johnstones, was there...
Thank you.
How much competition was there for the Johnstones?
Oh, quite a lot.
Was there?
Really, yes.
So
you had the Benathan Gallery
Yeah.
in Sydney, and that was a huge gallery as well. And I mean, Kim backed it up by having jazz concerts, and he was involved in motorcar racing, and all of that built an image for the gallery as well. And then you had the Australian galleries in Melbourne. I mean, they'd been going for nearly as long as Bryant, and that's now in its second generation of running. So you had quite a number of galleries.
Yeah, Macquarie Gallery in particular.
Macquarie Gallery was
Yes.
still going.
So Ian Fairweather, who was, producing work in Bribie Island, was all going to Macquarie Gallery in
Galleries,
Sydney.
they had total. People used to queue up and put up a tent for 4 days to be first in the gallery to get a Fairweather.
Including Robert Hughes, who complained bitterly.
Did he? I didn't know that.
He had to stand in line like everyone else.
Yes.
Mm.
I don't know any of you that are willing to just camp outside for a couple of days to get to a show. The nearest I had was Virginia Ferrier, and we sold out in 7 minutes.
That's a world record, 7 minutes. So I suppose looking back then, are there any anecdotes? Is there something from that period when you were there, those couple of years, that stands out?
Oh, probably Brian saying, and there's Marge over there in her stage whisper, because Marge could project her voice wonderfully, and you could hear it through the building.
So even in a whisper, she could enunciate and be heard.
Yes, very definitely.
Simon?
Look, many things. I think when you went round their house, what I remember was at the time people were trying to build the American white box cube art gallery. So it was very clean and very minimal and white. And the Johnstones was this multicoloured, multi-journeyed house upon house with building bridges across. And and Brian wanted you to go on a discovery of art, so you would come across something. And that was so different from seemingly in my mind, to everyone else's way of hanging things, which tended to be very clinical and evenly lit and, let the art do the talking. He made the experience of art. You wanted to be there. And if you wanted to be there, and if you wanted to get close to the Johnstones, even for them to say hello, you looked at the art and you just dreamt about what you might be able to have. And it was you walked away a happier person, I think, and lots of people did. And the Sunday, they had this where they would have a Sunday morning opening, which was in the garden, which is where I was, and it was just such a great. People would just go there to talk about whatever it was that they talked about. And they'd talk about the art, but they would just meet with people that loved the idea of art and the importance of art.
Well, it sounds like something that they really need to, re-establish somehow. It sounds like a wonderful experience. But I'm really still intrigued about that pairing of Brian and Marjorie. How did they meet, and how did that come about?
Well, as far as I know, Victor, can you?
No, I don't know.
There's my father is in the who are great friends, and my mother is here. They certainly met in Brisbane, and she was, I think, 9 years older than Brian. And Brian was relatively new to town, and I think they met at a party, and they bonded very quickly. They became very close, and I think they married. My memory is the story they married very quickly. My memory of the story is that Margie's parents, the Mants, were not so happy about this man opening an art gallery. They didn't really think that was a legitimate business. And I remember there being quite a bit of tension about that. I have a feeling that there was something about money at the wedding, that they wouldn't put any money into the wedding and Margie had to fund it all or something. There was, Victor, ringing any bells with you? But
no, not on the wedding part, but I'll expand a bit on the houses, because when the parents died, Marge inherited that property, which was initially 2 cottages, or 3 cottages, one across in the back. And so it was from those 2 cottages that were built during the 30s, during the Depression. And the tennis court was where that started. Brian built the first gallery. When you went up the stairs, you went into the first gallery. And that was the one that he did after the TB. And then it expanded from there. I mean, each year it extended a bit further, and they took in the second house and built a connection between the two, and probably quite illegally on the council, but anyway. And also, it's interesting you mentioned about colour, But there was no colour in the Johnstone Gallery. It was the paintings that were the colour.
Yeah. Well,
Otherwise, it was always a dead white, not white. It was never white. It was always white that was broken down and dark greys all through the whole building.
true. You're absolutely right. Although
No, it's interesting that you remember it as being colourful because that
That's right.
says the paintings were speaking to you.
Well, and that's an interesting thought. Although they did have a Ray Crook in the dining room on a black wall.
Yeah.
And I'd never seen a painting. Well, I don't think I'd ever seen a painting on a black wall, and it just jumped out at you.
But it wasn't a gloss wall; it was a matte wall.
No, it was a matte wall.
So again, how did the pair come to, with their different skills, come to become so good at displaying paintings? I mean, again, he was a soldier and
Brian
uh,
she was an actress.
it seemed to be inherent in Brian, not so much Marge. They'd fight over the paintings, particularly if Brian wanted to sell one. There was always chaos on. But generally, they made a background. I mean, it had a mossy green carpet through the building, and grey in the galleries, and green in their own living quarters. But the walls were white that was matted down with black, so that it was a very pale grey. And the darker ceilings, the ceilings were all charcoal.
Is that a technique that's used today?
I don't think so.
No.
Maybe
and
at
yet
Mona.
it's interesting because Brian showed Scandinavian furniture at one stage in his gallery. He was an innovator in that and architecture. It was all in the 60s. He did all of that.
IKEA? No.
Hardly IKEA. But very beautiful Scandinavian
Yes.
furniture. And so he was introducing all of that. And then he was in contact with other furniture makers here. I can't think of his name now, but there was one down in Wickham Street, and he was on very good terms with him. So that, and yet that wasn't what Brian or what Marge had inherited, was mainly antique pieces.
Right.
So the desks they had were Regency period, and the grand piano was much earlier. And
Did that look out of place? No?
no, it was dark, it was black. But you didn't look at that. There was the paintings, as Simon said, that you saw. You know, there was a magnificent Drysdale above it. So you didn't bother looking at the piano, unless Marge was playing.
So what was the legacy? What did they leave us? What things can we say that the Johnstones left the Australian or even the international art world?
Quite a lot, but it's just interesting enough about the house. As many of you know, the house was demolished, and I remember I was working at the Brisbane City Gallery, and someone in the architectural heritage office rang me and said, "Oh, I'm such and such. I'm doing a heritage study of Sintra, Bowen Hills, and apparently you know something about the Johnstone Galleries." And I said, "Yes, I do." And he said, "Well, we'd like to list the house." And I said, "Well, you're about a year too late because the house is gone." And you know, I used to think even at the time about how fantastic it would be to have it as a house gallery and a house museum. And there's been much discussion about whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. But I did say it to Brian, and he was adamant. He said that, you know, I'd never want to be involved in a mausoleum. You know, art's about living, and it's not. You know, my house isn't going to turn into a museum. And I'm sure he said that.
I worked on him for a long time on that one, but it didn't work.
Yeah.
And I got the same answers as you're saying.
But I have a feeling, Victor, that if you know, the plan was, and I'm getting to your question.
No, that's okay.
The plan. I think it's because Margie was much older. I think the expectation was that Margie would die before Brian because she was often in ill health, and I think that would have given Brian the chance to sort of collect his thoughts a bit about the legacy part. But as it turned out, he died unexpectedly, and before Marge, and so Marge was having that difficult thing about taking on what Brian's legacy was. And I think there's a few complications to that story that maybe Victor knows, but maybe no one knows about just what might have happened if Brian had lived on and time had passed.
And nobody can answer that one,
No.
I think so.
No.
But he was always adamant because I always wanted him to. turn it into... Well, I mean, his own collection alone was enough to make it a venue for people to go and see in the garden. Just how the garden grew, over the years. I mean, the torso you were talking about, the girl with the cross-eyed tits, but she used to sit in the back courtyard outside their bedroom, and that used to get purple lavender growing over it. Not lavender, purple lantana growing over it at different times, so that you'd barely see a little bit of face out of it.
But I think just on the legacy part, what I find frustrating is, living in Canberra and looking at what's going on. If you go to the biographies of Olley and Blackman and Boyd and Luby, and if you go to the index, you will very often not find the word Johnstone Galleries written there. And that's a travesty against art history, but also a travesty against Brisbane. And I think dare I say, a southern issue about, if it happened in Brisbane, it can't, it just didn't, it wasn't important. Whereas we know that, Arthur Boyd, maybe it certainly wasn't his first one-person show here, but it was certainly a significant one-person show when it was at Hugh Hale, sold nothing, and it was of the Wimmera series. So, really major art went through Brian, and those artists that we now think of really major national artists potentially may not have continued without the support of Brian and Marjorie at that critical time in their development. And I don't think that gets the recognition that it needs to. And I think that story is yet to be fully expressed and pushed, I guess.
Well, I might just throw to Helen Cole, Senior Librarian here, to tell us a little bit more about the collection. Helen? Want a microphone?
Sit down here.
Oh, no.
Go on.
Yes. Maybe I'll stand behind Victor. Okay, there we go. That's better. Yes, as has been alluded to already several times tonight, the records of the Johnstone Gallery were bequeathed to State Library, and they are truly one of our treasures. They include 16 scrapbooks that cover the entire period of the gallery from 1950 to 1972, and then they actually continue to about 1987. Marjorie continued to put extra things into them. And they include all of the exhibition catalogues, the invitations, the press reviews, but also lots of very personal things like Christmas cards from the artists to the Johnstones, and often those Christmas cards have original artworks. So they're, as well as our Drysdale, as well as our Drysdale drawings, we have Coburn screen prints and Ray Crook mono prints.
Drawing of the golden coach of the Queen's in London?
No, I don't think so. Someone's got that one.
No, they sent it back from London, and there was a drawing of the coronation coach. Oh, not a drawing, but a watercolour of the coronation coach.
No, it's not there as far as I'm aware. But lots of other little bits and pieces that show the idiosyncrasies of the Johnstones, their interest in the royal family, their friendship with Vivian Lee and Olivia, just so many things. But also there's a full set of all the exhibition catalogues that the gallery did. Over 100 correspondence files with all of most of their artists, and as has also been said tonight, they were the outgoing and the incoming correspondence. So you get a full story of what was happening in the gallery, and their photograph albums. And also, following our receipt of the Johnstone material, Arthur Davenport, who had documented the gallery in photographs for a number of years, his wife donated the collection of those photographs to the library as well. So we've got both sides of the coin. We've got the written and the visual documentation of the gallery. It's an incredibly important archive for research purposes, and we often are called on upon to help research provenance of artworks from galleries all over the country from that archive. So we're really happy to have it, and happy to have it on display tonight, just some of it. So we have cutting books, the scrapbooks on the first table, then the photo albums and some of Arthur Davenport's photos. Well, they're in the little suitcase there, but you can put them on the light box if you like. And then just a selection of the correspondence, that some of which shows you what a wicked, wicked man Brian was, what a wicked sense of humour he had, but also his genuine friendship with his artists. And then on the final table, there's just some of their exhibition catalogues, which in themselves were a bit of a forerunner of the way things were going to happen in Australian art circles. So when we finish talking, I invite you to go and have a look at those. Thanks.
Thanks, Helen.
Thank you.
Now, are there any questions? Does anybody have any questions?
Victor, do you remember what the interior of the bomb shelter gallery was like in the Brisbane Arcade?
I didn't. Funnily enough, I actually worked for the real estate agents who managed the building, but I never went into the gallery. So I don't know. I can't tell you that.
But
No,
there are photos.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yes, there's plenty of photographs to see. But it had a striped awning out the front of it. And it was down the stairs into the basement, and Magda Wallner and the Old Vienna was directly opposite him.
If anybody has a question, they can put up their hand, and there's a microphone that Candy can give you, so you can speak into that. Just over here.
My question is just about the business practices. It's contested with the Australian galleries in Melbourne and the Johnstone Gallery, who introduced the modern business practices in the galleries. I want to know what they are. Is it just the catalogue, that modern catalogue, or was it Brian's whole way of documenting his artists, listing everything? It's just a small point, but I'm just wondering what this modern practices
not quite
were.
Clear on your point, but
Oh,
the catalogues
Sorry.
did develop. I mean, they were very simple in the beginning, and some of them would have had lists of works.
yeah,
That depends on whether you got the list in time.
yeah,
And some of them were just straight cards, announcing who the artist was.
yeah.
And so it all has developed from that until now we make a full circus out of it.
Yeah, I guess it's just about how the whole process of what the selling processes were in the gallery. It's just a small point.
No, well, it required somebody to come into the gallery to see the works, and people then wanted to know background of the artist or something like that. And you had to have all of that knowledge you still do, have to have all of that knowledge readily available. Nowadays, we actually have full biographies available for people if they need that,
Well, Brian's got those biographical notes in that collection.
Not that many, not as comparison to what we would do now.
No.
But that's what I say, it's all developed enormously over the years in terms of what the public as such demand.
I think there's the one thing that impressed me about Brian was at some stage, and I don't remember exactly when, Victor, but he would publish a whole 12 months program for that year.
Yes.
And I don't know whether he was the first to do that, but even today, it's really hard in a commercial gallery, even a national gallery has trouble being absolutely sure about it 12 months out. About whether an artist is going to produce, what they're going to produce, and that idea about saying, here's the list for the next 12 months, just gave you a sense, I think gives a sense of he was running it like a business. But he needed to, because he needed to make sure that everybody knew what was coming up, because if they wanted a Drysdale, they've got to get in the line, because, you know, that's what it's going to take.
Well, I mean, even in Brian's day, costs were starting to mount up and overtake.
Any more questions? Yes?
Thank you. You described the physical gallery really beautifully, and I'm getting different sorts of images of it. So you've described the colours and the discovery of the spaces, but I think what I'd like to push you on a little bit more is the ambience. Could you name the ambience? Was it enchanting, or what was it about it? Because it seems as though this gallery played quite a large part in the business, in actually selling the paintings, yes?
I don't know that I can describe it in one word, because after all we had pegboard walls, and there's a nice little anecdote for that Margaret Olley and Brian went on for years and years, with Olley wanting him to put hessian up and paint it. And Brian was adamant that he wasn't going to, but they never had an argument about it. Because it was much easier with pegboard to slip a hook in and just hang your paintings on those hooks. But a lot to do with Marge's arrangements too. I mean, she had a lot of material of Milton Moons, which the jugs were leaked and things like that, so she kept them and used them as holders for different materials. And the big yuccas that we used to have in the garden, we used to chop those and she'd use those. She also had horrible plastic gourds that she somehow used magically and tied together with rope and whatever. So there was always something different in that way in the gallery. I mean, it might be just a bunch of wattle leaves. But she came in at the end of, after a show was hung, and always added those things to it, you know. And if Brian decided it needed green, and we had green. And so it was always part of the dressage for the show. And each show was treated very individually in that way.
So it sounds like it was a very organic process. It sort of evolved into this.
Yes, I mean, we all
special
had our
place.
own roles. I mean, you say, did I talk to Brian much? But we didn't really, because we both had separate jobs, you know, in that sense of doing things. And it's a bit hard to explain the gallery in the sense without it actually doing a diagram for you. And I mean, it got extended, as I said, literally every year. You know, we had a space at the end of the second building, which was the artist studio, so that artists could come and stay overnight. And then at the end, in the early 70s, we built the Annex Gallery, which was the house next door that Brian acquired. So they're all extensions of where Brian was progressing. And the gallery was always kept very neutral. I think that's the thing that one has to take into account.
So and just to, I mean, Victor's absolutely right. In my memory, is the colour is coming from the paintings. But if you were trying to find one word, it's stylish. You know, the sense of it wasn't ikebana, but you know that sense of just a little something that you see as very pedestrian, Marge, or somehow magically it was.
She'd make it something.
And you just go, wow. And then it would
She
just
was a
make
very
sense.
stylish lady. And there's a wonderful portrait of her that Ray Crook painted. And he sat her down to classical music and just painted her in, she had a grey cape suit, and just painted her in that. And it's just quite a wonderful portrait.
Well, we might finish on that note, I think. But if you do want to ask more questions, we'll be around for the next 15 to 20 minutes. And of course, go over and have a look at and read some of the letters, and have a look at 1971, the scrapbook there, and you'll see some Drysdales. Fascinating. Would you thank with me Simon Elliott and Victor Mace? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
some exotic